One page, not a treaty, not a United Nations resolution with 100 signatures, not the product of years of multilateral diplomacy. One page, and according to people close to both Washington and Tehran, that single page may have just done something that 40 years of pressure, proxy wars, and near misses could not. It may have pulled the Middle East back from the edge. But here is the part that nobody in mainstream media is talking about. There is a third capital watching this unfold in near silence. And in that capital, there is a leader who is not celebrating. Because if this deal holds, his entire strategic playbook collapses. We are going to go through this document, what is in it, what is not in it, and what both sides are not telling you. We are going to examine the economic pressure campaign that broke Tehran's resistance. We are going to look at what China is quietly calculating. We are going to look at that third capital, Jerusalem, and explain why this agreement puts Benjamin Netanyahu in the most difficult strategic position he has faced in years. And at the end, I'm going to give you 3 scenarios for what happens next, and ask you a question that I think will genuinely divide this comment section. Stay with me, because by the time this video ends, you will understand this story at a level that most analysts are not reaching. Let us start with what we actually know, because the gap between what is confirmed and what is being reported matters enormously here. What is confirmed? A direct negotiation channel between American and Iranian envoys has been active, not back channel. Not through Oman or Qatar, as has been the diplomatic norm for decades. Direct. That alone is a structural departure from 46 years of diplomatic architecture. What is reported but not fully verified, the framework involves Iran agreeing to pause high-level uranium enrichment. It involves a return to International Atomic Energy Agency inspection access. And in exchange, the United States would provide some form of sanctions relief, including access to frozen Iranian assets sitting in third-party accounts. Assets that, depending on the estimate, run into the tens of billions of dollars. What remains genuinely uncertain, whether any of this represents a durable agreement or a tactical pause designed to buy time and economic relief without surrendering the core program. These are not the same thing, and I want to be direct with you. Anyone presenting this as a clean, settled outcome is either working from incomplete information or not being straight with you. The honest read at this stage is more complex and more interesting. Here's the first open loop I want to plant in your mind. Why did Iran agree now? What specifically broke the resistance that had held for years? The answer is not simply sanctions. Sanctions have been in place for decades. The answer involves a specific mechanism, a financial pressure campaign that operated below the radar of most international reporting. We will get to that. But first, we need to understand what Iran was actually building and why. Iran's nuclear program has never been purely about nuclear weapons. That framing, while useful as a headline, fundamentally misreads the architecture. What Iran has been constructing over decades and at enormous cost is leverage. The enrichment infrastructure is not just a weapons pathway. It is a negotiating position, a survival guarantee, an insurance policy against the fate of leaders who gave up their programs and then watched what happened next. Iraq disarmed. Iraq was invaded. Libya cooperated on WMD. Libya collapsed. The lesson Tehran drew is not complicated. It does not require ideological analysis. It is simple strategic logic. States that disarm do not always survive. States that do not disarm remain at the table. This is confirmed behavior, observable across multiple administrations, multiple Iranian presidents, and multiple rounds of international pressure. So the real question, is not, why does Iran want a nuclear program? The question is, what price was finally high enough to convince a faction within the Iranian system that a temporary pause was worth the risk? Now we get to the mechanism that most analysis is skipped. By the period immediately preceding these talks, Iran's economic situation had reached a qualitatively different level of strain. The Iranian Rial had experienced sustained compounding depreciation, not a short-term market shock, but a structural degradation of purchasing power that was visibly affecting middle-class Iranians. Inflation was running at rates that made basic economic planning difficult for ordinary households. But here is the part that is usually left out of the narrative. The pressure was not just from traditional American sanctions. It involved a systematic campaign to target secondary actors, any firm in any country that was processing Iranian energy transactions, European companies, Asian intermediaries, financial institutions in the Gulf. One by one, the channels through which Iran had been moving money were being identified and cut off. Iran did not simply run out of money. Iran ran out of ways to move money. And when you cannot move money, when your frozen assets are genuinely frozen and your oil revenue cannot reach your own government's accounts, the calculation changes. Not the values, not the ideology, but the practical arithmetic of state survival. A faction within the Iranian leadership and Iranian decision-making is never monolithic. There are always competing centers of gravity, concluded that a temporary, bounded agreement offered something specific, economic oxygen, without requiring permanent surrender of the strategic architecture, because here is what a pause is not. A pause is not dismantlement. A memorandum of understanding is not a treaty, and the technical knowledge already accumulated, the scientists, the centrifuge designs, the enrichment data, does not disappear because the centrifuges stop spinning. From Iran's strategic perspective, they are not giving up their program. They are putting it on hold while the economic pressure valve is released and watching to see what the next American administration does. We have seen this exact play before in 2003, in 2013, during the JCPOA period from 2015 to 2018. Each time, Tehran demonstrated the same pattern: temporary restraint traded for economic relief, while the underlying infrastructure is preserved rather than eliminated. Whether this time is different is the central analytical question, and I will give you my honest assessment toward the end of this video. But right now, I want to talk about something that is generating almost no coverage. There is a capital that has been watching these negotiations with a level of anxiety that its public statements do not fully reveal: Jerusalem. To understand why this deal is a strategic nightmare for Benjamin Netanyahu, you need to understand the doctrine that has governed Israeli security thinking for decades, a doctrine sometimes called the Begin Doctrine, after the Israeli Prime Minister who ordered the destruction of Iraq's Asyric reactor in 1981. The doctrine is simple: Israel will not allow any hostile state in its region to acquire nuclear weapons capability. And crucially, Israel reserves the right to act unilaterally to prevent that outcome, regardless of what any international agreement says. For years, this doctrine gave Israel a kind of strategic clarity. The threat was clear. The response option, a preemptive strike on Iranian nuclear facilities, was always on the table. Uncomfortable to discuss publicly, but present. Now consider what this framework agreement does to that calculus. If there is an active U.S.-Iran diplomatic process, one that Washington is invested in, one that the White House has publicly signaled support for, then an Israeli preemptive strike against Iranian nuclear facilities does not just mean conflict with Iran. It means Israel acting in direct opposition to an American diplomatic effort. It means Tel Aviv making a unilateral military decision that blows up Washington's biggest foreign policy initiative in the region. The political cost of that with any American administration is enormous. And Netanyahu knows this. In effect, this agreement functions as a leash, not an official one, not a signed document saying, Israel, you may not strike, but a political reality that makes a preemptive Israeli military operation against Iran substantially more costly than it was 6 months ago. Here's what makes this genuinely difficult for Israel's strategic position. If they strike and the deal collapses, they own the consequences. The regional escalation, the potential Iranian retaliation against Israeli territory, the diplomatic rupture with Washington, the international condemnation, all of it. If they do not strike, and the deal eventually unravels, as previous agreements have, Iran may emerge with better economic conditions and a program that is only temporarily paused. Israel will have waited, under American pressure, for an outcome that does not materialize. There is no clean option here, and that is precisely why Israeli statements on this agreement have been so carefully worded, acknowledging the diplomatic process while making clear that Israel's right to self-defense remains unconditional. Watch the language from Jerusalem in the coming weeks. It will tell you a great deal about how seriously the Israeli security establishment believes this framework will hold. Before we go further, and we still have China, the Strait of Hormuz, and 3 scenarios for what happens next, I want to say something directly. If you are watching this channel, you are part of a smaller group of people who actually want to understand how the world works. Not just what happened, but why, and what the implications are 3 moves ahead. That is what this channel exists to do. If you're not subscribed yet, do it now. Not because I am asking you to click a button, but because the stories coming out of this region over the next 6 to 12 months are going to require exactly this kind of layered analysis to make sense of, and you will want to be here for that. Now, China's official position on the U.S.-Iran negotiations has been carefully constructed to sound supportive without actually being supportive. Beijing has called for dialogue, for a return to multilateral frameworks, for the preservation of the JCPOA architecture that the United States previously abandoned. What China has not done is work to prevent the bilateral American-Iranian channel from developing. That silence is significant, and it requires explanation. China has a 25-year strategic cooperation agreement with Iran, signed in 2021. China has been, in various periods, one of the largest purchasers of Iranian oil, providing Tehran with an economic lifeline precisely when Western sanctions were at their tightest. The relationship is real, documented, and strategically significant. So why is Beijing not actively opposing a deal that would reduce Iranian dependence on Chinese patronage? The answer lives in a body of water 30 miles wide. The Strait of Hormuz, approximately 1/5 of all seaborne oil in the world, transits through this single choke point. There is no alternative route for supertankers exiting the Persian Gulf. The strait is bordered by Iran on one side and Oman and the UAE on the other. For decades, Iran's implicit and sometimes explicit threat to close or disrupt the strait has been the structural foundation of its deterrence strategy. It is why a country of 90 million people with an economy smaller than several European nations sits at the absolute center of global security architecture. For China, a military confrontation in or around the strait is not an abstract concern. It is an existential economic risk. A significant portion of the energy that powers the Chinese economy moves through that channel. Any disruption, and even a temporary one, creates cascading effects through supply chains, manufacturing, and economic stability. So China is doing what great powers do when two other players are moving toward a deal that partially serves their interests. It is staying out of the way. But there is a cost, and Beijing is calculating it in real time. An Iran that is less isolated is an Iran that is less dependent on Chinese patronage. An Iran with access to international capital markets and recovered frozen assets does not need Beijing's economic lifeline the same way. China's leverage, the quiet structural leverage of being the buyer of last resort for Iranian oil, becomes less valuable if Iran can sell to everyone. This is the quiet tension at the center of Beijing's position, and it explains why Chinese public statements on these negotiations have been calibrated to appear constructive without actively enabling an outcome that reduces Chinese regional influence. Watch Beijing, not what they say, what they do not say. Now, the historical comparison that I think matters most here. In 1994, the United States reached the agreed framework with North Korea. The deal froze plutonium production at Yongbyon in exchange for energy assistance and a pathway toward normalization. At the time, it was described in language remarkably similar to what we are hearing today. A breakthrough, a genuine de-escalation, a turning point. Within 8 years, the agreement had collapsed. North Korea had developed a parallel uranium enrichment pathway that the framework had not adequately addressed. The strategic calculus on both sides had shifted, and the country that agreed to a freeze eventually crossed every threshold it had promised not to cross. Now, I am not telling you the Iran framework will follow the same path. Historical analogies are instructive, not deterministic, but there is one crucial difference that makes the Iran situation potentially more tractable than North Korea ever was. Iran's economy is deeply integrated with the global system, or it was before sanctions. North Korea's leadership made a strategic choice to decouple from international markets entirely, to build an autarkic state that could withstand external pressure indefinitely. Iran never made that choice. Iran's middle class, its educated diaspora, its oil-dependent government, all of them have a structural interest in reintegration. There is a constituency inside Iran for normalization that simply did not exist in North Korea. Whether that constituency has enough political weight to drive durable compliance, that is the open question. Let us talk about what actually happens next. There are 3 realistic trajectories. I will give you each one honestly, including the probability I assign to each, and the conditions that would push events in each direction. The first path, a durable framework. The agreement holds. It is formalized over the next several months. Iran implements the enrichment pause. IAEA inspectors return. Sanctions relief begins flowing. Both governments manage their domestic critics, and slowly, incrementally, trust building creates the conditions for a more permanent arrangement. This is the path that gets the headlines if it happens. It is not impossible. The economic incentives on both sides are real, but it requires something that no previous Iran agreement has fully achieved, a structure robust enough to survive a change of American administration. The JCPOA did not survive that test. Any framework built on executive action rather than Senate-ratified treaty faces the same vulnerability. The second path, tactical pause, then renewed confrontation. Iran accepts initial economic relief, uses the breathing room to stabilize domestic pressures. Then, either because the internal Iranian political balance shifts, or because a future American administration withdraws, the framework unravels. Enrichment resumes. Sanctions are reimposed. The regional tension returns to, or exceeds, its previous level. This is not pessimism. This is pattern recognition. It is the trajectory that has repeated most consistently in 46 years of U.S.-Iran diplomatic history. The third path, managed ambiguity. Neither side fully delivers what was promised. Iran implements partial compliance. The United States delivers partial sanctions relief. Both governments declare success to their domestic audiences. The enrichment program slows but does not stop. The IAEA reports anomalies. The international community collectively decides that an imperfect, ambiguous situation is preferable to open confrontation. This path is, historically, the most common outcome in negotiations of this kind. It is not a success. It is not a failure. It is the place where geopolitical reality tends to land when the aspirations of diplomacy meet the constraints of domestic politics. It can persist for years, sometimes decades, and it has one significant practical advantage over both other scenarios. It keeps the shooting from starting. Before I give you the closing question, the one that I think will genuinely divide this comment section, I want to name something that tends to get lost when we talk about this story in purely strategic terms. The populations living inside these calculations are not abstractions. In Iran, years of economic pressure have produced visible, documented hardship. Not for the political elite. They have mechanisms to protect themselves, for families, for young people, for a middle class that grew up with a connection to the global economy and has watched it severed. The cost of prolonged coercion falls hardest on people who had the least say in the decisions that created the situation. If a framework emerges, even an imperfect one, even a temporary one, that reduces the probability of military escalation, the people who benefit most are not the analysts or the governments. They are the ones living closest to the consequences. That matters. Even when, especially when, we are trying to think clearly about strategic logic. So here is what we can say with analytical confidence. A direct negotiation channel exists. It represents a structural departure from decades of diplomatic architecture. The economic pressure campaign appears to have been sufficient to shift Iran's calculation, not permanently, but enough to bring a serious faction of its leadership to the table. The framework, whatever its final form, faces structural vulnerabilities that have undermined every previous Iran nuclear agreement. It involves a player, Israel, that has strong incentives to disrupt or complicate the process. It involves China, which is calculating its own interests with characteristic precision, and it involves domestic political pressures on both the American and Iranian sides that could fracture any agreement regardless of its technical merits. Whether what emerges is a durable framework, a tactical pause, or a prolonged managed ambiguity, the answer will not come in a news cycle. It will come from what states do quietly, away from cameras, when the deadline pressure has passed and the hard work of implementation begins. And that is a story worth watching. Now, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want to know what you think. Here is the question. When you step back and look at everything we have just walked through, the economic collapse that brought Iran to the table, the leash it puts on Israel, the way China is positioned to benefit without having to commit to anything, here is what I keep coming back to. Was this Trump's masterstroke, maximum pressure delivering what diplomacy never could? Or did Washington just give Iran the economic oxygen it needed to survive, restart, and come back stronger in 5 years, while calling it a victory? There is no obvious answer here, and I think where you land on that question says something interesting about how you read American power. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this kind of analysis is what you come here for, subscribe, because this story is not over. Not even close.